In war, collapses do not always arrive with a single, dramatic defeat. Sometimes they begin as small breaks on a map, thin cracks that commanders believe can be patched. Then the crack widens, momentum builds, and suddenly an entire front stops behaving like a line and starts behaving like a retreat. That was the German experience in France in the summer of 1944. By late July, the Allied invasion of Normandy had been underway for more than 6 weeks. The landings on June 6 had succeeded, but the fighting inland had been slow, brutal, and exhausting. Normandy's bocage, the thick hedgerows, sunken roads, and small villages, was a defender's world. Every field was a fortress. Every lane was an ambush site. Allied progress was measured in yards, not miles. From inside the German command structure, this slow pace created a dangerous belief that the invasion, while serious, could still be contained. German infantry and armored units in Normandy were battered, but they were still holding. British and Canadian forces were pinned into costly battles in the east. American forces pressed in the west, but faced the same hedgerow nightmare. If the front could be stabilized, Germany's leadership hoped it could preserve its remaining strength for the far greater threat in the east, where the Soviet advance was devouring entire army groups. At the top of the German system, however, reality was already poisoned by politics. The July 20th assassination attempt against Hitler had shaken the regime. Suspicion spread through the officer corps. Trust collapsed. Every setback looked like sabotage. Every suggestion of retreat could be interpreted as disloyalty, and Hitler's orders became even more rigid. Hold ground. No withdrawals. No admissions that the front might need to bend. Generals who understood the danger often kept their words carefully controlled. They knew that the war was now being fought, not only against Allied armies, but also against Hitler's refusal to accept operational reality. Then, on July 25th, the battlefield changed shape. The sky over western Normandy filled with aircraft. American heavy bombers, followed by medium bombers and fighter bombers. Their target was a narrow section of the German front near Saint-El. This was Operation Cobra. It was not simply a bombing raid. It was a deliberate attempt to pulverize a defensive zone so thoroughly that the American ground assault could surge through before the Germans could reorganize. The effects were catastrophic for the units under the strike. Command posts were erased. Communications lines vanished. Forward positions were shredded. Survivors emerged dazed and scattered, unable to report clearly. Some companies had no officers left. Some battalions had lost their cohesion entirely. A defensive line can survive being pushed back. It can sometimes survive heavy losses. But when command and communication collapse at the same moment, the line stops functioning as a system. The Germans tried to respond in the way they had been trained to respond: seal the breach with armored counterattacks, restore the front, regain balance. But the breach Cobra created was not clean. It was chaos. And it widened fast. American ground forces pressed through the shattered corridor and expanded it outward. German counterattacks were piecemeal. Fuel shortages limited movement. Allied air superiority punished every visible redeployment. Roads became killing zones in daylight. The Germans could still fight, often fiercely, but they could not fight with freedom of maneuver. And then came the hinge moment. On July 30th, American forces seized Avranches. Avranches mattered because beyond it lay open country. Past the hedgerows, France opened into terrain where armored forces could move at speed. The bocage had been a natural break on exploitation. Avranches removed that break. From a German perspective, Avranches was not simply a town lost. It was a door kicked open, and through that door came something the German command did not expect to face from the Americans at this scale: rapid operational maneuver. On August 1st, the Allies activated the U.S. Third Army under Lieutenant General George S. Patton. German intelligence knew Patton's reputation. They understood he was aggressive, energetic, and obsessed with speed. They had watched his performance in North Africa and Sicily. Some German officers considered him reckless, Others respected him as a dangerous commander. But few understood what would happen when Patton was given open terrain and a broken enemy front. Patton's army did not push forward like a force expecting to grind through resistance town by town. It moved like a force trying to outrun German recovery. His divisions spread outward quickly, some thrusting into Brittany, others pivoting east toward the interior. Instead of fighting every enemy position, Patton's columns often bypassed resistance, leaving isolated pockets behind for follow-on units to handle. This was a war of momentum, and momentum is merciless to an army whose fuel is scarce, whose communications are broken, and whose leadership is constrained by orders that forbid flexibility. Within days, German reports became increasingly alarming. Towns fell faster than garrisons could prepare. Units found themselves outflanked before they understood where the enemy was. Supply depots were captured. Roads were flooded with retreating forces. In some areas, German troops were not defeated in battle. They were simply bypassed and cut off. Allied logistics played a major role. Fuel trucks and supply convoys rolled forward continuously, feeding Patton's movement. The Americans consumed enormous amounts of gasoline, but for a critical period, their supply system managed to keep pace. Meanwhile, German vehicles stalled for lack of fuel. Tanks could not redeploy. Trucks were abandoned. A unit that cannot move is not merely weaker. It becomes irrelevant in maneuver warfare. Inside German headquarters, the mood shifted. At first, the breakout was treated as a local emergency. The assumption was that the Americans would advance methodically, as they often had earlier in the campaign, giving Germany time to build fallback positions along rivers and high ground. That assumption collapsed under the pace of Patton's movement. By the first week of August, the German leadership began to see something deeply humiliating and frightening. An American general was now conducting a campaign of speed and exploitation that resembled the German successes of 1940. The blitzkrieg was being used against its inventors. Hitler's response was to demand a counterattack. He believed Patton's advance had created an opportunity. If German armor struck westward and cut the Avranches corridor, the spearheads could be trapped. A decisive blow could restore the front. This counteroffensive, launched from the Mortain area, known as Operation WWII, began on August 7th. It was, in many ways, the last attempt by German armor in Normandy to regain initiative. It failed quickly. The German attack ran into prepared American anti-tank defenses, concentrated artillery, and rapid Allied reaction. And above all, it ran into Allied air power. Fighter bombers struck German columns repeatedly, turning roads into burning wreckage. Tanks were destroyed or immobilized. Vehicles ran out of fuel. The attack stalled, then broke apart. Instead of sealing the corridor, Germany spent precious armored strength in a doomed gamble. And while German panzers burned near Mortain, Patton continued moving. This is where the catastrophe became operational, not just tactical. As Patton's forces drove east and north, they threatened to cut off the German armies still fighting in Normandy. At the same time, British and Canadian forces pressed from the north and east. An encirclement began to form. The Falaise Pocket, for the German 7th Army and elements of the 5th Panzer Army. The danger was immediate. If the Allies closed the gap, tens of thousands of troops could be trapped. The German command tried to organize withdrawals, but Hitler's insistence on holding ground delayed movements. Orders changed slowly. Units received contradictory instructions. Traffic clogged the limited roads available, and Allied air attacks made daylight movement deadly. Inside the forming pocket, scenes of collapse unfolded. Vehicles jammed narrow routes. Horses pulled wagons through craters. Wounded men had no transport. Tanks stood silent without fuel, crews destroying them to prevent capture. Units became mixed together, officers unable to locate their own troops. Command posts moved and then disappeared under bombardment. Allied artillery and aircraft hammered escape corridors. Thousands of Germans escaped, many on foot, slipping through gaps before the pocket fully sealed. But what escaped was not an intact army. The equipment did not escape. Tanks, guns, trucks, ammunition, supply stocks, much of it was abandoned or destroyed. The German army that emerged from Normandy had lost the heavy tools needed to fight a mobile war. It was still an army, but it was an army stripped. And in modern warfare, an army stripped of mobility and firepower becomes an army that can only delay, not decide. As the German retreat continued, France began to slip away rapidly. Towns greeted Allied columns with celebration. Resistance activity intensified. German rear guards fought in places, but they could not rebuild a continuous defensive line fast enough. Paris became a looming concern, not only for its strategic value, but for its political symbolism. German command understood what losing Paris meant for the legitimacy of occupation. But occupation was collapsing faster than symbolism could be managed. As resistance activity increased and German control weakened, Allied forces approached the city. Patton's units reached the general vicinity, but higher Allied command coordinated the entry so Free French forces could claim the honor of liberation. A political and psychological decision, as much as a military one. Patton's main effort continued eastward, toward river crossings and routes leading to the German border. By late August, German leadership faced a reality they could no longer disguise. The Western Front had transformed from containment into pursuit. The Germans had entered Normandy believing they could pin the Allies in hedgerows and bleed them slowly. Instead, they were now being chased across France. The reasons were not mysterious. Operation Cobra shattered a defensive sector. Avranches opened the gate into open country. Patton exploited that open country with speed and bypass tactics. German fuel shortages limited movement. Allied air superiority punished every redeployment. And Hitler's rigid orders delayed withdrawals until they became routes. Patton's advance also revealed a larger shift by 1944. The Americans had mastered large-scale combined arms maneuver. They could coordinate infantry, armor, artillery, engineers, and air power in a way that produced rapid operational results. German officers who had once dismissed American capability were forced to reconsider. The Americans were no longer learning. They had learned. In the quiet hours inside German command rooms, officers likely asked questions they could not speak aloud. What if withdrawals had been ordered earlier? What if armored units had been concentrated for defense instead of fed piecemeal? What if flexibility had been allowed instead of punished? What if reality had been acknowledged before the front became a flood? Hindsight offers harsh clarity. But during the crisis, German commanders were trapped between operational necessity and political obedience. And that trap was lethal. The breakout from Normandy did not end the war, but it changed the Western war permanently. From that point forward, Germany would fight defensively, trying to slow a coalition that now had the initiative, the resources, and the momentum to carry the war to the borders of the Reich. France had been occupied for 4 years. Its liberation would be achieved in weeks, and as the German High Command watched the map redraw itself in enemy colors, towns, rivers, provinces shifting out of control, they confronted a truth that could no longer be hidden behind speeches or orders. The Western Front was no longer something they controlled. It was something they were surviving. And in war, the moment an army shifts from controlling events to merely surviving them, the outcome is no longer in doubt.